His hands were calloused, the fingers knotted where he gripped ropes and blades. He smelled of pine and wet leather and the animal smoke that clung to hunters. When he set his pack down by the stove and moved a chair closer to the fire, a book slipped from his pack and skittered across the floor like a small, dull animal. It landed near Mary Beth's journal, its cloth spine rubbed thin. She bent to pick it up, not quite because of the book, but because the book had drawn attention to itself like a small comet. The title was a neat line in ink, a man's name, and the letters were strangers to the mountain man. He reached for the book and his fingers faltered, as if the letters had weight and might cut him. He watched the words on the page the way a man might watch smoke. There was a tiny panic in his breath. Something in his chest tightened, the way a bowstring draws when a hunter senses danger. Mary Beth had seen hundreds of small shocks in her time, a child's first lurch for a cookie, an old woman's hands dropping the cup in surprise. But this she recognized from the mirror of her own shame, the look of someone meeting in ink the thing he had been taught to be ashamed of. She had known shame too, though hers wore a different coat. In high school, when the town had turned a joke into a brand, she fled into the safety of the ledger and the kitchen and the quiet solitude of the pen. The man who couldn't read had the same inward crumple of defeat she recognized in herself. "Sit by the fire," she said without thinking. "Warm your hands." He obeyed by reflex, and not because she had offered kindness as a cure. He cradled the book as if it were a small animal and thumbed the page in an absent, clumsy way, murmuring a sound that might have been a name, but had no letters to hold it. "Where do you come from?" Mary Beth asked, already cataloging the answers she would accept. A name of the settlement, a trade, how long he'd be staying. "West, past the bluffs," he said. His voice was a low thing, roughened by wind and silence. "There's stew," Mary Beth said, "and a bed, if you'd like." He nodded. He needed shelter like a wounded bird needs a tree, and he needed it the way the snow needed the hearth's warmth. He did not say where the book came from. He kept patting it as if the motion might soothe an ache. After supper, when the rest had cleared, the regulars do so, with little nods and bowls scraped clean, Mary Beth found herself lingering with the stranger. Her mother, who ran the inn's accounts alongside her daughter, had a way of watching people as if she could read their coin from their faces. She had barely glanced at the mountain man. She had seen men like him and had long ago learned not to ask too many questions. "I keep a spare bed by the back," Mary Beth told him. "There's a blanket stiff in the corner." She pushed a mug his way. The steam fogged his mustache. "You can leave your pack on the porch in the morning." He told her a name that sounded like the bark of a spruce in a wind tunnel. Elias. She would learn later that the name was simpler than the years that had made him. When he unrolled his legs by the stove, the room contracted around him, but it also held him as if the bricks remembered shelter. There was something watchful in the hollows under his eyes, not the wary glance of a thief, but the slow measurement of someone learning the borders of a new life. The first night, when the inn had settled into the soft rhythm of choked fires and muffled snores, Mary Beth sat with her journal and put down, in a handwriting that had always been neat, the simple fact that another person had stepped into their small orbit. She did not write what she would do next. She only wrote the shape of the new man by the stove, a note to herself. He likes the pot roast. He watches the fire like a man looking at a memory. Elias woke with the dawn light gone thin. He came just as Mary Beth was stacking plates, his hands folded around a chipped mug. When he spoke about the book, his mouth pulled small and embarrassed, like a child admitting to a broken thing. "It belonged to a preacher's trunk I traded for a hide," he said. "Saw an old man reading it once and thought—" He barked a laugh that stopped short. "Thought maybe, if I kept it, I could learn the words. But my hands shut up when I look at them." Mary Beth paused with a towel between her hands. The backstory came out in fragments, like a trail of footprints through snow. Elias grew up in a cabin on the mountain. His father was a man who beat more than rock into a shape. He used to say things, Elias said, jaw tight, made a man shut down, said nobody needs words, said I was stupid in front of the fire. He touched the pale seam by his jaw as if the scar had a name, burned a letter once, said letters were not for him. Mary Beth heard the words and saw the map they had left on Elias's skin. Every scar a valley, every hush a river. The mention of being called stupid struck like a pebble in her own pool of memory. She remembered Thomas Whitmore's laughter years earlier, the way the town had used his voice as an excuse to be cruel. She knew the quiet that followed, how small a person could feel when the world decided to measure them by one short, ugly word. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," she said. The words came softer than she expected. "But I can teach, if you want." It was a simple offer, almost dangerous in its simplicity. She had no letters of authority, no certificate, no formal plan, only a slate, some chalk, and the quiet patience that had been seeded into her by a life spent in slow acts, sweeping, mending, setting kettles. The idea of teaching a grown man to read might have seemed foolish to many. To teach Elias was to pick up a soft weapon against an old violence. To offer to teach was to say aloud that words belonged to everyone, even a man with his hands clumsy around ink. That night, she moved the table so the light fell on the slate. She drew the first letter, a thin, single stroke. She wrote it large enough for him to see, then smaller, then she traced it with her finger like a seam in a coat. Elias watched without saying anything for a long time. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on an old hurt. Finally, he reached out and let his finger follow her line. The slate was cool. The chalk left a whisper of white that stuck to his calluses. He made the stroke once, without meaning, then again and again, until his hand held the movement. They began as one does with any stubborn thing, terrible with hope. Her mother came in with a basin and paused at the doorway. She had the plain look of someone who weighed not only the needs of a stranger, but the gossip of an entire town. "There's the back room," she said to Mary Beth, not displeased but wary. "Make sure he eats. Keep the ledger straight." She did not need to say the rest. Be careful who sees you bending for the hard things. But Mary Beth had learned to bend for things that mattered. The early lessons were slow. Letters were not rescued by the warmth of the stove. They required that Elias unlearn the old rule that things made a man stupid. He had learned to hide the look of not knowing. When a child asks a question and is turned away, the child's body learns to make itself small. So did Elias's body learn. He practiced lifting his hand to the slate as if it were an old, awkward dance. Sometimes his movements were clumsy. Sometimes the chalk dust puffed like the memory of snow. He cursed under his breath when lines bowed wrong or when the letter refused to look like the shape Mary Beth drew. But he also brought gifts. The first week, a game hen lay pinned with a strip of leather on their doorstep. Another morning, a neat stack of seasoned oak. He knocked with a bone-rough hand and tucked the gifts like people who didn't yet know how to speak their gratitude. He was used to giving with his hands what he could not give with letters. Mary Beth accepted the meat and the wood with a kind of barter smile that belonged in that community. The mountain had given him what he had to exchange, and she had learned to take that as the currency it was. She, in turn, left small scraps of paper beside his plate some mornings, a single word written plainly, then 2 words, then a short phrase. Bread, warm. Fire, dry. Cat, 3 legs. The scraps were like little stepping stones across a stream. At first, he would tuck them away into his pack, though perhaps the habit was less about hiding than about collecting, gathering proof that something might yet belong to him. The teaching itself took root in the housework. She would hand him a wooden spoon and say, "Stir," and then write the word on the slate. She would hand him a needle and thread and then write "sew," the round letters echoing the stitch. She led the lessons through the choreography of daily life. The alphabet was not just a list of shapes. It became the names of the things he could already do. A letter was a plank on the bridge he had built with his hands for years. This way, learning was not a punishment, but a naming of his own work. At night, he carved letters into scraps of wood to feel the grain break under the blade. A, then B, then a crude swirling of C. He was a man used to making marks in hides, carvings on beams, but these marks had been given the power to shame him before. Now, with her patient, even voice, Mary Beth put the power back in his hands and re-lettered his life. She kept a journal of their lessons in the margins of her own book. Not the confessional pages, those she kept private for the softness of her own heart, but a practical list. Elias practiced A-B this week, legible G, traced name twice without looking away. She recorded this like one might keep a garden journal, noting frost dates and the first timid bloom. The ledger of others was kept for business. The private pages of her life cataloged small bravery. Each victory was a blossom in a season she had not known she could harvest. There were stumbles. Once, Elias found a word and ate its meaning with caution: cat. He had been giving the word on a slip in exchange for tending the hearth, and had grinned like a man who had come upon water. He wrote cat on the slate clumsily, the letters leaning on one another. He said the word aloud as if it had weight, then laughed at the sound of it. The laugh was small and sudden, and for a moment Mary Beth saw him like a creature who'd been given sunlight. The room seemed to wait, breath suspended, like the inside of a drawn bow. Another day, he took pen to paper and made a shape that looked vaguely like a bear. He had scratched it in the margin of a grocery list they'd kept as a joke: bear, and then the price of sugar, then tucked it under a pot and forgotten it. Mary Beth found it later and kept it as if it were a child's doodle on a napkin. It became a talisman for the lessons, imperfect marks that meant progress. Sometimes, after a day of practice by the stove, they would sit in the dim light and let words be quiet between them. She would read a paragraph from a book she liked, not long and florid, but plain, like a letter from a friend. Her voice softened in the way of people who read to the sick or the very young. Elias would listen and close his eyes, letting the cadence of sentences find lodging in his ribs. Once, she read him a passage about a river and the way a man finds his path. He reached out and pressed his palm to the page before she could stop him. An old, superstitious habit, maybe, or a way to prove that the thing did not hurt him. As they spent more time in one another's company, small rituals formed. She would draw a letter on his palm with chalk, then have him write it in the condensation on the window. He would leave a strip of cured hide and anchor it in his pocket like a prayer. She taught him to sound a word out, a clumsy workmanship of vowels and consonants, and he took to it like a man relearning to walk on a broken trail. He learned not to beat himself when he erred. Once he shouted in frustration at a letter that had refused to fit, and then he sat with his forehead flat to the table, breathing a long, slow breath. She drank her tea and did not hurry him, because she had her own memories of falling apart in the middle of chores and surviving the shame. Weeks folded into months with the quiet steadiness of Cooper's beating hoops. The seasons slid, the mountain let go of ice and let green push through. The townsfolk began to notice the mountain man's continued presence in the inn. Some murmured approval. The inn always needed hands in custom. But others were quick to line up their judgment like pickets. The news of Elias's presence threaded its way through coats and knew of him as a curiosity, the hulking hunter who read by a hearth. Mary Beth found herself measuring how much she let others see. The town had a memory like a ledger that did not erase easily. She had been the subject of its kindness and its cruelties all her life. The offer of teaching was an act of defiance she had not meant to stage. Such little rebellions rarely are. She taught because she saw how the firelight might make hard lines softer. She taught because she had a ledger in which she wrote the names of people she would not let the town flatten into a story. Elias, for his part, did not move on the town's terms. He noticed looks but did not answer them. He measured his own advancement by the size of the marks he left. His calluses softened into the careful movements of a man learning to make letters speak. His handwriting crept forward, first an awkward capital, then smaller, careful cursive that belonged to no school. He started to sign his name with the same hand that had carved out his life, E-L-I-S, a set of strokes like steps on a path. He trembled a little the first time he did it without being told. The day Elias wrote his first whole word unprompted, the inn seemed to hold its breath. It was late in the afternoon. The light slanted sideways through the frosted glass and cut the room into golden bars. Mary Beth had been stitching a curtain sample and singing under her breath, careful stitches like the stitches of a prayer. Elias sat opposite her at the table, the slate between them. He had been practicing the letters of animals because it made the abstract concrete: cat, dog, bear, horse. He had scratched them into chunks of wood, traced them on the grain, said them aloud while he chewed an apple. The word had been an enemy, then a friend. He picked up the chalk like a soldier where his only weapon had previously been a blade. He hesitated, as was his rule, and then drew. The letters came shaky but straight. He drew 3 letters, and they sat in the white like small, stubborn flags. C-A-T. He sat back and looked at the word on the slate, his chest rising as if he had run up a hill. Then he said the word out loud, carefully, like pronouncing someone else's name for the first time and waiting to see if they returned the greeting. Cat, he said. It should have been nothing, a child's word, but when he spoke it, something in the room changed. Mary Beth's hands, which had been steady, stilled. Her eyes brimmed in an altogether new way, not sad, not ashamed, but astonished in the soft sense of someone seeing a stubborn miracle of ordinary fabric. The word was not magic. It was labor. It had been earned. Elias, who could skin a deer and mend planks with a craftsman's eye, had now coaxed the abstract into being. He had given the shape of sound a visible body. For Elias, the milestone was a small lifting. He set his fingers on the letters like someone placing a palm upon a map. The crack across his jaw seemed to soften under the light. He let out a laugh that was part disbelief and part gratitude, and then reached across the table and, with a clumsy, tender motion, tapped his thumb against Mary Beth's wrist, as if the contact might anchor the new thing. She touched his thumb in return. "You did that," she said, and her voice had the warm steadiness of an old bell. Her heart, which had learned to hide from the town's eyes, felt the first honest pulse of a new claim. She wrote in the margin of her ledger later that night, "Elias, first word." A small entry. The paper could hold a whole life if it were allowed. Words spread in the gentle, dangerous way words do. Mr. Jameson, who ran the general store and had little love for gossip but great affection for truth, mentioned seeing Elias reading a potter's ad. Sarah Chin, who kept a tidy vegetable patch and an even tidier sense of propriety, dropped Mary Beth a warm note about the kindness of teaching. People who saw the mountain man with a slate felt complicated things, some sympathy, some curiosity, some old discomfort. There were those, of course, who would rather the story not change. The town was a set of old habits. Human nature, even in a place with so much open sky, liked to tidy itself by telling simpler stories. Mary Beth kept teaching. They moved from single words to stitched phrases. Elias learned how letters gathered into names that might hold a life. He practiced his own name until the E sat like a small flag, the L a steady post, the I a soft breath, the A an opening, and the S a closing curve. On a night when the moon was thin and the inn smelled of stew and the wick of the lamp was nearly gone, he wrote his name again and again, then, with a tenderness that startled Mary Beth, underlined it twice. "That's yours," she said simply. The word belonged to him now in a way it had never done, when his father's contempt would have been the only teacher. He folded the slate into a pile of rags and tucked it by his bed like a secret. The slow work changed the rhythms in the inn. Dinners became more companionable. Elias learned to read labels at the pantry and to tally in his head with a ledger in his hands rather than guess. He began, clumsily, to write short notes for Mary Beth, a folded scrap left by the bread, thanking her for the stew. The notes were crooked but sincere, and she kept them in the same pocket where she kept the carved bear doodle he had left inadvertently under the sugar bowl. They did not speak of love at first. There were other things to do: wipe the table, tend the hearth, repair the hinges on the back door. Love, if it would come, arrived in the small decisions one made when no one was looking. One more log stacked, one more word written, one more plate passed without complaint. Both of them carried the scars of previous storms. Mary Beth of ridicule, Elias of a father's harsh lessons. But they also carried gifts of a different kind: competencies and patience, and the stubbornness required to read the world with fresh eyes. One evening, as the frost lay thin and delicate over the inn's eaves, Elias came in with more than wood. He had taken a trail to the ridge to trade for a length of leather and had found, tucked into a hollow of a tree he'd never thought to look in, an old piece of paper. It was yellowed as if the sun had sighed on it often. The edges were soft from being handled. Someone had once treasured it before they could not any longer. He brought it in and without much ceremony laid it on the table before Mary Beth. She smoothed it with her palm. The paper had a single line across the top in a hand that, to her, read like an old map. She could not quite make out all of it, but the curve of the letters suggested a name. It had been abandoned, and in its abandonment, it had become a kind of relic of the small sorrows of the road. Elias watched her face for the kind of small miracle that teaching can bring, the recognition that something once thought lost may be returned. "Maybe it's a sign," he said. "Maybe it's for you." Mary Beth laughed, a tiny sound that belonged to the hearth. She did not need signs. She needed steady things: a roof that did not leak, a ledger that balanced, words that could be shared. But because she liked small theatrics, she folded the paper and handed Elias the pen. "Write on it," she said. The pen was clumsy in his hand at first, shapeless as a strange tool. He stiffened and then steadied, as he had doing so many things lately. The ink dabbed at the paper, dark and new. He wrote one letter, then another. The paper held it like a mirror. When he finished, he stared at the line as if it were a horizon he had only just found. It was not his neatest hand, nor hers the most practiced eye, but the words that carried across that yellowed page were no small thing. They were his attempt at a sentence, a crooked, knotted string of sound turned into marks. He had taken the timid step from labor and hunt to the slow, trembling act of naming. Mary Beth thought of all the small bones of her life lined up like plates. She thought of the journal she had kept in case the world ever showed warm enough hands. She slid the paper into the folio she had kept for the minor miracles of the inn and smoothed the cup of her palm over it until the line warmed. On the mantel, the fire popped like a small applause. Outside, the storm had gone south, leaving the road a clean way through the mountains. In the space between the hearth and their small table, the two of them sat marked by light. They had been altered, not by some sudden revelation, but by patient repetition, by the total of small acts that daily repair does: teaching, giving, holding, forgiving. The townsfolk, of course, were ready to narrate the change. Rumors are cheap when they travel on cold feet. The mountain man might be a danger, or he might be a novelty, or perhaps the girl with the inn was foolish to be friendly to someone the mountain had scarred. The truth was less dramatic. He was a man learning letters and a woman who would not let a scar be a sentence. Their days held simple rhythms, and the world outside began to taste of something like expectation. After one of Elias's more promising sessions, after a morning when he had written the name of a colt down as neatly as a man might write his own promise, Mary Beth stood at the hearth and smiled the way someone smiles at a newborn's first awareness. She felt the urge then to ask something small of anyone who might be watching, as all good storytellers do for their audience. "If this is finding you in a quiet hour," she said without ceremony, as if it were a whisper meant only for close ears, "and if a man's first word made you glad, then leave a mark. Tap like on the door, and stay for the rest of the night. It would mean—" She paused, and the sentence never finished with anything but the warmth left in the air. The request felt graceless and true. It was not a demand, it was a small invitation for company. It landed softly and was perhaps absorbed into the hush the inn carried in its bones. Elias smiled at her then, a slow, frank arrangement of teeth. "You are the one who rewrites a life," he said, and the words were blunt as an axe, but not cruel. He meant it as gratitude. He had been the mountain man who could not see a path through letters, and there she sat with a slate and a kindness that resembled a map. He had felt himself rewritten, not by decree, but by the patient skeleton of instruction. He had been given permission, first in the chalk dust on his fingers, later in the steady shape of his name. They did not know then that their work together would reconfigure not only their own boundaries, but the little town's map of who belonged where. They could not have known the hot and cold currents of gossip that would follow, nor how some would line up to praise and others to jeer. Those were pictures for the next season. For the moment, the mountain and the inn were still, their lives balanced like a seesaw that had just found a center. Papers lay in drawers, wood was stacked and meat salted. There was a ledger with neat columns and a ledger with softer notes. Mary Beth kept teaching. Elias kept learning. Each letter he formed was like a slow stitch in a new garment, one that might, over time, cover him in a way that felt like home. Outside, the sky cleared and a thin crescent moon watched. Inside, the chalk scraped and the hearth sang. There were more lessons to come, longer words, sentences that could carry apologies and proposals alike. There would be missteps. The mountain had been a stern teacher. But for the first time since his father's words had been nails hammered into the boards of his self-worth, Elias felt a small, stubborn root take him, the sense that he belonged to a story someone else would help him tell. Mary Beth stood at the counter later and tucked the yellowed page into the back of her journal next to that private confession she had never shared. She closed the journal and rested her hand on the cover the way one rests a palm on a sleeping child's head. If letters could be a map, she thought, perhaps the map could be rewritten. If kindness could teach what violence had taken away, maybe the world could be rearranged by very small hands. The evening folded up like a quilt. The mountain man slept with a slate at his bedside. The inn, for the second night running, felt like a small vessel on a steady sea. Outside, the snow had left glossy patches on the road. Inside, marks had been made that would not vanish with a single storm. They did not know yet that the next weeks would test them in ways work and tenderness could not prepare them for. The sideways looks of townsfolk, the lit match of a rumor, the ache of a question that might finally be asked aloud. For now, there was only the scratch of chalk on slate, the smell of roasting meat, and the slow, faithful marking of a man learning to put sound into shape. Elias slept like a man who had walked a long distance and finally, for the first time in a long while, did not fear waking. His fingers still bore the pale residue of chalk. Mary Beth stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched him for a long time, thinking of the small things that change people: a book brought in out of the cold, a slate laid flat on a table, a hand that will teach another how not to be afraid of ink. There were pages still to fill. There were slates to clear and words to stitch together. There would be the moments a town remembers best: declarations and accusations, a letter folded and delivered, a hand that takes another's in a promise. As the night closed in, she opened her private journal, and, in letters that were her own and meant for nothing but the warmth she kept inside, wrote a simple note. He learned his first word today. The slate holds it now. The inn knows a new sound. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like a low, watchful thing. Inside, chalk dust danced in lamplight. The mountain had not given him letters until she offered a slate and a single stubborn kindness, and that was only the beginning. Spring folded into summer with the slow insistence of a rocking chair. The slate that had once been Elias's timid classroom stayed at the table and collected not only chalk, but the smudges of habit, spilled tea marks, the thumbprints of a man learning to carry softness in his palm. He moved from naming animals and tools to a sort of grammar of feeling, short notes that carried thanks and small apologies, then sentences where he tried and failed and tried again. Mary Beth watched him at work the way one watches a sapling straighten after winter winds. The muscle in his forearm that had been used to hauling hides softened into the careful press of a pen. He learned the way ink pooled on cheap paper and how a long downstroke should be finished with a light hand. He copied phrases from a worn book on the inn's shelf, phrases he favored for their plain honesty. He traced them once, twice, then without looking, as if the letters might be a kind of weather he could predict. Sometimes he misread his own lines and laughed aloud in a way that made her laugh back. The sound of his laugh had become a small place of safety in the inn, something to which she had learned to lean. One afternoon, months into their lessons, Elias went down to Mr. Jameson's store to barter for some nails. The general store smelled of sawdust and pine oil, with a pocket of sunlight warmed by the open door. Mr. Jameson, in the habit of tall men who have learned to weigh a person before a load, set out the nails with a nod. "Price?" Elias asked, steady but careful. Mr. Jameson listed it. Elias, who had only ever counted up coins in the rough math of a trade, unrolled a scrap of paper Mary Beth had tucked into his pocket. A short sentence she had shown him earlier. "Count the coins." He read it aloud, stumbling at first, but correcting, then finishing in a voice that made the shopkeeper look up surprised. "You're getting on it," Mr. Jameson said, not unkind. He had been one to keep to himself, but he had watched what teaching had done near the inn with something like approval.
Keep it up, folks will see. Word spread faster than Elias's progress diagrams. Where there had once been curiosity, a sliver of admiration began to push in. Sarah Chin, who traded her vegetables for a bed for a friend now and then, considered the mountain man not as novelty, but as neighbor. She brought a small jar of pickled plums and tucked a note into Mary Beth's apron pocket. Good on you for staying kind. There were gestures like that, small, private, the sort that stitch a town together more than any broad public statement. Not all stitches held. Mrs. Kelton's voice had the way of darning needles, sharp and precise.
She had watched the mountain man's long visits with suspicion and had stored the sight of Mary Beth tending him in a drawer of indignation. People like her kept a ledger of propriety and were quick to point out each new line they considered an error. "The inn's a respectable place," she said to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. "Don't know what's twisting in some heads to go teaching a rough sort how to read. Next thing you know, the whole place will be turned loose." Her sentences were not always cruel, but they were tidy and practiced. They found ears. Gossip is a small bird that nests on any branch where heat gathers. It bubbled up in the afternoons when people traded goods and news by the counter. That the innkeeper's daughter was seeing company, that the mountain man was too proud or not proud enough, that something unwholesome might bloom in the gap between youth and wilderness. Mary Beth felt it like a breeze that touched unwelcome places. She bent her head over the ledger more often and let the food be colder by the plate, trying to keep the town's tongue quiet. She knew how ridicule could sharpen into a brand. She had worn one once and remembered how it fit against her skin. For a moment, she considered stepping back, letting Elias go his way, extinguishing the small flame they'd been growing so that no one would have an excuse to point. Elias read the change in her as easily as he read a trail. One evening, bone-tired from sawing a new shelf for the pantry, he found her on the stoop sweeping, the hearth lip cooling. Snow was a faint memory on the ground, but the air still held a crisp edge that made breath look like cloth. He set a strip of cured hide on the step and sat down beside her without speaking. "You can stop," she said before he could. Her hands did not tremble, but her voice held the brittle thing of someone who had held back tears long enough for them to feel like a memory. "Stop what?" he asked, not looking up. "All this," she said. If the town has words," Elias said, and his tone was honest as a ledger. "So do we. I'm not ashamed to learn." He could have turned it into a battle. He could have let the old rule, silence in the face of shame, return. Instead, he reached into his coat and pressed his hand against hers, not in bravado, but in a simple, brotherly sort of ownership. "You taught me that letters are not nails stuck into a man. They are tools. I like the work. I like you." The sentences were not ornate. They were the kind of plain architecture he had always favored, beams and pegs, honest and useful. Mary Beth looked at him and saw the slow accumulation of small changings, his hand steady, the way he read a menu aloud for a child, the short, steady notes he left in his own coat pocket. The town's fuss was an old current. She had learned to let stones sink into it. "I like you too," she said, and the words felt both dangerous and liberating. Gossip did not cease because one stubborn couple refused to fold to it. It shifted shape. For some, it hardened into spite. For others, it found itself ashamed. For a few, it became curiosity that leaned toward kindness. Mrs. Kelton continued to shake her head at the sight of Elias at the inn, but even she paused one morning to see him writing a child's name on a scrap and stopping to spell it carefully for the youngster. The gesture cost her less to tolerate than to condemn, and she watched, an eyebrow curiously lowered.
The real test came when Thomas Whitmore, the man who had once laughed at Mary Beth and then drifted in and out of worse choices, returned to town. He had the look of someone whose self-importance had aged like sour cider, sharper at the lip and cloying in a way that made people distance themselves. He saw the mountain man in the inn one afternoon, sitting by the stove and reading a scrap of paper with a boy peering over his shoulder. "Well, well," Thomas said to no one in particular as he pushed the door open, "if it isn't the mountain man everyone has fussed over. Thought you was no better than the beasts." The inn went, for a beat, oddly quiet. Conversation snagged. People looked to see what else would be said. Mary Beth felt the old burn in her cheeks. Thomas's voice had been the instrument of a humiliation once. She had learned to curl into herself in the face of it. Elias did not rise to insult the man, but when Thomas's tone turned to the old jibes about being stupid and the room tensed as if it might split, Elias stood. His height marked a silent line between Thomas and the hearth. "You don't have to speak that way here," Elias said. His voice was not barked nor wholly mild. It had the flat authority of someone who had spent a life measuring things and deciding to set a boundary. Thomas laughed too easily, the sound of a man who thought ridicule a good coin. "And who says," he said, but the room narrowed like a held breath. Mr. Jameson cleared his throat and looked to the men in the room, then to Mary Beth. "Mind your manners, Thomas," he said. "Cooper's Inn is a place for trade and rest, not insults." A few heads nodded. Sarah Chin adjusted the strap of her basket and gave Thomas a look that suggested she'd learned to hold her tongue when it mattered. Someone else, an older woman who had once lost a son to the mountain, stood and dropped a coin onto the counter, shaking her head at the man's cruelty. The town's defenses gathered around the inn like honest bricks. Thomas snorted and left in a cloud of dust that smelled of stale beer. But the damage of his words held a small aftertaste. Mary Beth felt the old scab pull. For a night or two, she flinched whenever a newcomer looked long. Elias noticed, and, in the way of people who teach and learn, he taught in another register. He taught her to keep the ledger of her courage. He would fetch a stool when she looked like she might shrink and sit by her shoulder. He started, one morning, to leave small notes on the kettle in her hand. "You are brave," written in a shaky script that he had practiced until his hand stopped betraying him. The notes were an exercise in naming, of the quiet strengths he had learned to see. She, who had once learned to make herself small, found she could keep the notes like talismans and pull out their words when she needed them. Their affection ripened not in one grand speech, but in the daily clearing of plates, the small weaving of lives that made a household. Elias showed Mary Beth how to fix a door hinge so it did not drag in winter. She, for her part, coaxed him through sentences about grief and things that had happened in the dim corners of his youth. He taught her that a man could be shaped by cruelty and still be gentle. She taught him that being seen did not always lead to shame. And then there was the letter. Elias had been carrying a scrap of paper in the breast pocket of his coat for weeks, a folded thing that he had traced with thumb and callus until the crease softened. He had practiced his lines on the margins of a trading receipt, then on a strip of wood, then again on a slate, until the movement of each letter felt like a step he could walk in his sleep. He wrote it and then rewrote it, crossing out a line, then trying it in another hand. He wanted the asking to be true, but not grander than the men he had known. He wanted to be clear, because words had once been the instrument of his humiliation. On a morning that smelled faintly of rain, when the mountain air had the bright, clean smell of newly turned earth, Elias laid the folded letter on Mary Beth's plate before breakfast. The slate lay nearby, dusted with the ghost of yesterday's practice. Mary Beth had a moment of thinking it might be a bill, or a note from Mr. Jameson, or a complaint from Mrs. Kelton. Instead, the neat, clumsy hand of Elias met her eye. She opened it with hands that remembered trembling. The paper was thick in the way of old accounts, the ink smudged at one corner and smeared like an afterthought. The sentences were simple and unvarnished, the sort to be found in the best of frontier vows. "Mary Beth," it began, in a line he had practiced until the stroke matched the meaning. "I came here with a pack and a book I could not read. You have taught me more than letters. You taught me to stop hiding. I did not know how to ask a woman to marry me without the afraid part of me thinking the world was looking. I have learned to write the truth. Will you marry me? If you say yes, I will make you bread, mend your roof, and watch the fire when you are tired. If you say no, I will still keep the slate by my bed and the memory of how it felt to learn my name. E." He had folded the letter neatly, edges aligned as if he had measured them with the care of a tradesman finishing a joint. When she read the final line, "Will you marry me?" something in the inn eased.
She looked up to find Elias standing by the doorway, not awkward at all now when he wanted to be honest, holding a small, worn box in his hands. He had nothing to offer but what he had, and he held it like a gift the mountain had given him, a ring braided not of gold, but of leather and brass, two simple bands wound together. It fit his fingers the way a promise might fit a hand. He knelt as if he were doing the unwieldy thing of men in stories, and his voice, low, even now with a tremor, fitted the letters he'd written. "Mary Beth Cooper," he said, "will you marry me?" Her answer came not as a sudden, crystal clarity, but as the accumulation of small certainties. She saw in his eyes the steady work of months, the chalk dust on his knuckles, the careful loops he had learned. She thought of the ledger pages where she had written his first word, and of the scrap of carved bear she kept under sugar. She thought of all the ways he had taught her to be less alone. "Yes," she said, the word a line, both short and long. The room held the ceremonial hush of a household taking a new shape. The town met the news with the cautious curiosity of a place that valued stability. There were looks traded, and the same old rumors that traveled faster than honesty. But there were also hands that moved to set things right. Mr. Jameson offering a handful of nails for a new door, Sarah Chin dropping a bowl of stew, Mrs. Kelton, after a long pause, bringing a small tin of tea to the inn in a gesture that was not precisely warmth, but not open cold either. They married under the pine that stood on the edge of town, a tree both mountain and town could claim, its roots deep and visible enough that children liked to knot their fingers in them. The wedding was the sort of thing a frontier place knew: simple vows, promises made in plain speech, a circle of neighbors who had watched the couple grow from rumor to reality. There were no brass bands, only a borrowed fiddle and the clapping of hands that learned dances new to them. The ring Elias slid on Mary Beth's finger was not flashy. It was a small thing, like their life promised to be, sturdy and honest. The ceremony was followed by a meal that tasted of muscle, roasted meat, the sharp slices of pickled plums, bread with a crust so thick it could be used to knock the chill out of a morning. People lingered and listened to stories, and at one point, Thomas Whitmore, who had been invited and had accepted in something like humility, left without ceremony. The fact that he left did not matter much. There were enough who stayed to carry the day into night. Marriage did not erase the past. It stitched over it. There were days when a memory would flash in Mary's face and make her fold inward. There were nights when Elias woke, his hand on his jaw, listening for echoes of a father's voice that did not belong to his new life. But they worked together on the small things that build a home: a new latch for the cellar door, the raising of a child's cradle, a ledger balanced not only for trade, but for the honest inventory of a shared household. The sun came in a winter that was kinder than the one that had introduced Elias to Cooper's Inn. They named him Hope, as a conscious decision, not a flourish. Hope, the child, had skin like warm bread and a sharp curiosity that made the town forget itself for a day at a time.
He had his father's wide hands and his mother's small, careful smile. From the start, the family kept letters around the house as if they were ornaments that reminded them of who they'd been and who they'd chosen to be. Elias, who had learned to read to name things and later to shape them into sentences, learned to read for another reason now, to tell his son the stories that had not been told to him. He read from small books he had learned to love, stories of long rivers and stubborn women, of hands that built and the people they built for. His reading was slow at first, the words halting like someone carrying a heavy load up a hill, but each evening a little smoother. Hope would nestle into his lap, a small head against a shoulder that had once been braced against wind, and listen with a concentration that made Elias read as if he read not for himself, but for an apprentice's heart. Mary Beth kept a leather journal in which she noted months and small milestones, the day Hope first crawled, the first time Elias read a whole page without stopping, the first letter Hope tried to scratch with a stubby pencil. The journal's pages were a map of a life, not the ledger of an inn, but the record of a family assembling itself from lessons and bread. Elias started a journal of his own. His handwriting matured in the way calluses softened. The lines became purposeful, certain, and even tender. He would sit by the fire after the inn had quieted and write to Hope in a hand that sometimes betrayed the echoes of a man who still had to make himself do things the hard way. The entries were not large, sweeping proclamations, but notes and promises, instructions and memories he wanted to hand down. How to split a length of wood without wasting it, how to sew a button from a bitter winter, how the sound of rain can tell you when the ground will thaw. He wrote the things his father had never written, the things he wanted his son to have ready. One particular entry he wrote on a feverish spring night when Hope had fallen asleep with a slate in his little fist and chalk smears on his cheek. Elias took a scrap of paper and with slow strokes he had long since mastered, wrote a letter addressed simply, "To my son, Hope." He wrote of small survival, how to find the tenderest shoots of wild onions, how to know when a trail had been walked by deer and not man, how to make bread that keeps until morning. He wrote the things his father had never written, the things he wanted his son to have ready. One particular entry he wrote on a feverish spring night when Hope had fallen asleep with a slate in his little fist and chalk smears on his cheek. Elias took a scrap of paper and with slow strokes he had long since mastered, wrote a letter addressed simply, "To my son, Hope." He wrote of small survival, how to find the tenderest shoots of wild onions, how to know when a trail had been walked by deer and not man, how to make bread that keeps until morning. He wrote the things his father had never written, the things he wanted his son to have ready. He wrote of braver things too, and here his hand trembled a little despite the confident script. How to carry shame without letting it define a man, how to correct someone gently, how to ask forgiveness even when it costs the heart. He wanted his boy to carry tools of life, but also a softer set of tools, kindness, patience, and the willingness to learn. The final lines of that entry read, clumsy and lovely, "If you ever think you're small, you are not. We are made by hands and by words. Use both. Father." He folded the letter and placed it in a tin box he kept on the mantel by the hearth, along with Mary Beth's first page noting his first word and the carved bear doodle. The objects had become a reliquary, their way of keeping their progress and their pledges in a place both plain and sacred. Time taught them ordinary things, how to mend a neighbor's fence, how to take in a stranger for a night when a storm sent snow and fear together down the road. They learned how to host a child with a fever, how to split a winter's woodpile so that no one in the town would fear the cold. Their life was not an uninterrupted sun. There were storms, small betrayals of weather and health, and the slow wear of worry that comes when coin is short and the roof needs repair. Yet at the core of each day's trouble was the steady fact of each other. Mary Beth continued to teach in the margins of the day. She taught other women in the town, a widow how to read the price tag on a yard of cloth, a boy how to mark his sacks for market. She helped run the inn, and it might be that her ledger now carried not only transactions, but notations of names, who had stayed and who had left a note. Mrs. Kelton, whose tongue had once been a blade, found herself hesitant one afternoon to criticize a woman who had learned a short list of letters and brought home a note of her son's cured ham. The town was not made whole, but it had been nudged. Elias, too, taught in different ways. He led a small evening for the few men who came by, those who had learned to trust him enough to sit and share a pipe. He taught them not letters now, but ways of being gentler in their speech, pulling a phrase out of a book and talking about what it might mean to a man who had been told he was without worth. They talked about work and memory and how a single sentence can be an invitation instead of an accusation. His instruction was not one of sitting at a slate, but of the slow art of living without repeating the cruelty that had shaped him. Their son grew with the quiet insistence of the thing his name promised. He loved the sound of ink against paper, and once, on a sun-washed afternoon, scribbled his first letters in a puddle with a stick. Both parents watched as he made his first attempts and cheered in the small way of two who had learned to value incremental bravery.
Elias found himself reading aloud one evening a line he had written in his journal, and then, after a pause where the fire took his breath, adding another. The cadence of his voice had a strength to it now. It had learned its pitch through practice and the desire to hand down something useful. "I used to think words were traps," he said to Hope, who by then would be old enough to catch the rhythm of a story. "But they're a bridge. You build them with care and they carry you across." Hope, curled against him, made a small sound like agreement. The world outside could still be a place that hardened people, but inside the cabin warmth gathered in the mouths of small sentences and the pressing of fingers to paper. Years accumulate in a frontier town like leaves in a stream. Some float off, some catch on roots, and some sink into the mud. When Elias bent to write a note for Mary Beth on the day Hope was learning to write his own name, his handwriting was steady enough that a stranger would read it without guessing. He left the note on her pillow, folded precisely, and when she found it later, she read the simple line, "Tonight, I'll watch the moon with you." She pressed the paper to her cheek for a moment and then kept it in the folio. The folio grew fatter with each small event: birth announcements, a list of chores scribbled in the margin of a love letter, a child's first crooked A. The sour gossip that had once scoured the inn of heat had slowly become a softer conversation. Even Mrs. Kelton, who never quite unbent from her way of seeing propriety, stopped leaving the table with her chin lifted whenever she passed the inn. That did not mean she had forgiven everything the town had done, but it indicated a shift. The town had other accounts to balance now, and many of them were written with ink of a better sort. In time, the greater test of the past arrived like the winter that takes more than it gives. The faint echo of Elias's father. A man who had known him, a grizzled relative who'd followed old habits of cruelty, came through town. He did not harm anyone loudly, but his presence was a reminder of what Elias had escaped. The man had eyes like frozen rivers that did not look for the thaw. He stopped at the edge of the town one afternoon and watched the inn, watched the pine where Elias had been married, watched the child playing in the dust. He carried with him the same sharp language Elias's father had once used, small dismissals, and the heavy suggestion of worth measured in the old brutal ways.
The town's earlier fears that the past could return and unsettle their fragile holding woke up for a time. Elias saw him from across the yard and did not approach at once. He felt the remembered weight under his ribs, but also the steadying thing he had learned, that a man is not only what has been done to him. He walked over, with Hope at his hand and Mary Beth at his elbow, and they met the visitor under the pine.
He spoke, and his words were not chosen for offense. He spoke of work, and he offered a piece of bread, and he said, plainly, "We are building here. You're welcome to see it, but we will not let the past make our hearts small any longer." The man's reaction was a shuffling and then a turn. Maybe he could not stand so much steadiness. Perhaps the sight of a child named Hope was more argument than he could bear. He left town the next day, and the town, scarred but not broken, went back to its slow business. Elias, who had once thought a man's worth might be forever determined by the lash of another's tongue, had learned to set boundaries and to keep his son safe from them. The years braided themselves in the usual ways: harvests and small funerals, a patch of illness that took an old neighbor, a fair that brought fiddles and ribbons. Hope grew into a slender boy, then into a lanky apprentice of the mountain and the hearth. There were days when he made mistakes, and days when he astonished his parents by reading a line of Clements aloud without stumbling. Each misstep was corrected the way a parent shows a child how to tie a knot, with patience and a firm hand. Elias's journal grew into a careful library of small truths and practical knowledge. He wrote to Hope more than he wrote to anyone else. Sometimes the entries were simple instructions. Sometimes they were stories of a man who had been broken and then remade by patience and kindness. One particular journal entry, kept for years and reread often, became something of a map that Hope would consult when he grew uncertain. The entry began with the repeated motif of the house. "Keep the fire, keep the ledger, keep the doors you care for," he had written, in a hand at once rough and tender. Then he moved into a confession that was precise without being theatrical. "I carried shame like a sack of stones. Mary Beth took a slate and taught me how to carry a book instead. It did not make my troubles vanish, but it taught me something stronger, to say what I meant and to clear a space to mean it." He closed most entries with lines that were both fatherly and pragmatic. "When in doubt, count the coins, mend the roof, call your neighbor. Be honest with your son." The journal was his inheritance in words, a set of tools that were not only the crafts of hand, but the crafts of heart. One late evening, when the first small snows of the year had just begun to finger the edges of the road, Elias sat and wrote a long entry to Hope. The lamp's light feathered the page, and the whole house breathed around him. Mary's lullaby to a small child, the kettle's soft tick, the hush of a town sleeping on its own 2 feet. He wrote slowly, deliberately. He wanted each sentence to be something his son could hold when times were rough. He wrote about the slate and about the first word that had shifted something in him. He wrote about the letter he had once folded before asking Mary Beth to marry him, the tremor in his hand, the way the ink had dried crooked. He wrote about fear and about the small arms of a town that could hold a man when he learned new ways. He wrote of his father briefly, as one might touch upon a wound with a clean cloth. The past had been cruel, and the crucial thing was how to not repeat it. When he finished, Elias tucked the paper into the tin on the mantel and placed the journal next to it. He rapped the lid twice, and then, for reasons he couldn't entirely name, he took the journal down and read it aloud. His voice was steady now in a way it had not been when he had first read "Cat" from a slate. He read because he wanted Hope to hear the voice that had been folded into ink, and because hearing a father's words makes them more than a private rehearsal. It makes them a living thing. Hope, who had learned to read enough to catch the odd letter here and there, listened perched on his father's knee. "When you write that I am not small, does that mean I'm big?"
he asked, the bluntness of a child softened into curiosity. It means you're your own measure, not someone else's writing, Elias answered, and the sentence was both a reading lesson and a life lesson. He felt the smallness of his own past and the largeness of what he'd been given, and he tried to pass it all along in clean, simple language. The snow that year came slowly and cleanly. On the first night it began to fall, Mary Beth and Elias stood by the window, the family gathered around the hearth. Their faces were lit by the fire in that soft way that makes wrinkles look like riverbeds, everything carved out and full of history. Hope fell asleep on a rug nearby, a small thumb at his lips. Elias took down the tin and handed Hope the folded letter he'd written so long ago, now faded at the crease but still sturdy in meaning. "One letter at a time," he said, recalling the phrase that had come to mean so much. It wasn't a declaration of some grand, miraculous power. It was the truth of work. That's how you make things right. Mary Beth turned the pages of Elias's journal and read a line in her voice. "Use both hands and words." She then shut the folio and set it on the mantel where the tin of keepsakes lived with them. The mantel had become something like a shrine to the quiet victories, small, honest artifacts that marked a life remade. Outside, the first snow of the season blurred the world into a clean white. Inside, the fire popped and drew shadows on the beams. The inn's door hung shut against the wind, like a promise that one will keep. And in the yard, the pine stood as it always had, between the town and the mountain, a living thing that had seen both storms and weddings and the passing seasons.
Elias, for the first time in a life that had been defined by worn edges, felt enough of a center to write one last short note that night and lay it where Mary Beth would find it when she came to bed. It said simply, "Thank you for teaching me to read my heart." The words were clumsy and wholly true. She found him there as the house settled, his head bent over a new page. She slid next to him and leaned into the heat of his shoulder. They had weathered small cruelties and large winters. They had taught and been taught. They had, in the plainest way, rewritten one another by patient, faithful labor. Outside, the snow fell soft and steady, blanketing the road the way a hand might smooth a page. Inside, the family, wood smoke, ink, and the low breathe of a child asleep gathered around the hearth. On the mantel lay the journal, the tin with the folded letter, the carved bear doodle tucked inside the folio like an afterthought that had become a centerpiece. In the dim light, the letters on the journal's spine caught the glow and seemed to promise more pages yet. Elias turned his head and kissed Mary Beth's temple, his fingers finding the line of the scar near his jaw almost unconsciously. They had both been marked by things that had once said they were less than they were. Now they had a son, a home, and a ledger of small victories the town could not easily erase. The mountains still stood beyond them, patient and indifferent to the human reckonings below. It had taught and taken and given. But where once Elias had been a man closed like a folded letter, he had emerged open enough to let the light through. He had learned to write, to read, to speak, to bind a life with ink and a hand that could steady another. And in the end, perhaps the plainest and truest miracle of all, Hope would sit years later at the same table, fingers smudged with chalk, and read aloud a line from his father's journal. He would stumble at a word and then correct himself, and his parents would laugh and praise him, and someone in the room would press a warm hand to their shoulder and say, quietly, "That kindness has a way of changing a world if you kept at it, one small thing after another." If Mary Beth and Elias's story warmed you, subscribe for more heart stories, and share this one with someone who needs hope.